Hello everybody, this is NerdGasm, and this is my retrospective on all the mainline Resident Evil games. Today's video is on Resident Evil 5 from 2009. Its predecessor, Resident Evil 4, had broken new ground. It introduced a whole new generation of video game fans to the franchise, and helped innovate a lot of elements games in the third-person shooter and action genres would continue to utilize, even once produced, to this day. The immense popularity and widespread exposure of Resident Evil 4, everyone and their mother had basically played it, meant that there were even more fans of the series now, foaming at the mouths with anticipation over the release of the next installment. And when it did come out, gamers went to pick it up in droves. The sales figures of Resident Evil 5 don't lie. As I'm recording this video in late 2022, it remains the highest selling entry in the Resident Evil franchise. Because Resident Evil 4 had been so beloved and influential, making Capcom a shit ton of money in its own right, they would take that as a sign to keep embracing the shift in tone RE4 had on the series, distancing it from its survival horror roots and instead leaning heavily into the action, set pieces, and fast-paced gun combat. Just like RE4, Resident Evil 5 does still have its fair share of terrifying and tense moments, but they are few and far between. Same goes for the puzzles that had become a staple of the series up to that point. There are basically none to speak of here. I know a lot of traditional Resident Evil fans, in hindsight, sort of shit on Resident Evil 4 and 5 for all the changes they made to this series. Some would argue they ruined what made Resident Evil so special in the first place, and I know my opinion has very little value because I only started playing these games in recent years. I haven't been with the franchise since the very beginning, but at least RE4 and 5 still make some sort of an attempt, an effort to resemble the look and feel of those original games, even with their various adjustments. They're not Resident Evil 6. I think we can all be thankful for that. Resident Evil 4 and 5 are a lot of fun to play. Their stories are interesting and engaging for what they're worth. I enjoy these entries in the RE series, even if they are considered action games, more so than survival horror ones. But alright, let's get into the story and gameplay of Resident Evil 5. RE5 is set in the same year the game came out, 2009, 5 years after the events of RE4. Rather than play as Leon Kennedy or Jill Valentine again in this one, we get to play as Chris Redfield, who we hadn't seen since all the way back in Resident Evil 1. Now I know technically he was in Code Veronica alongside his sister Claire, but this is my retrospective series, and we're not looking at any of the side games, just the mainline numbered entries. Anyways, if you can recall, I had mentioned in my review of Resident Evil 2 that Chris had left Raccoon City shortly after the police department's Elite Special Forces unit, STARS, had been shut down, following the outbreak of the T-virus at the Spencer Mansion in 1998. He would travel to Europe under the guise of a vacation to take the fight to the Umbrella Corporation, investigating their main headquarters. Fast forward to 2003, Umbrella would crumble and declare bankruptcy following a series of trials held by the United States government, dubbed the Raccoon Trials, which held the pharmaceutical company responsible for the ultimate destruction of Raccoon City, all of the deaths that had occurred in it due to the T and G viruses. Unfortunately, the threat of Umbrella didn't stay buried, as many of its rogue scientists would sell the company's surviving bioweapon research to various rival corporations and terrorist organizations. In order to combat all of this, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine would join forces and form the counter-terrorism group sanctioned by the United Nations, known as the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, or BSAA. In 2006, Chris and Jill would receive a tip as to the whereabouts of Umbrella's founder, Oswell E. Spencer, who had become an international fugitive following the Raccoon trials. They would track him down to a remote castle estate where he and his remaining scientists were making attempts to resurrect his failed company. Chris and Jill would sneak into his castle with the intention of arresting Spencer, taking him in for questioning. However, they would find his bodyguards brutally slain, as well as Spencer himself, at the hands of his former employee, Albert Wesker. Remember, Wesker had been injected with a prototype virus, a unique strain of the T-virus, that had given him superhuman levels of strength, speed, and durability. It's how he was able to survive the Tyrant's attack at the end of Resident Evil 1. The powers he would receive from this injection would go straight to his head, and Wesker would develop a major god complex, believing he was destined to cause the mass extinction of the human race, allowing it to evolve into something far greater in his eyes. When Chris and Jill stumble upon the aftermath of Spencer's murder, they fight Wesker, but are no match for his superhuman abilities. Before Wesker can kill Chris, Jill would tackle Wesker out of the castle's window, and the two would plummet to their deaths. Their bodies were never found, though, and Chris believes Jill had somehow survived her fall. He takes on several missions with the BSAA, in the hopes of one day locating her. 3 years after Jill's disappearance, Chris is sent to Kaijuju, Africa, to investigate a new bioterrorist threat, which is where Resident Evil 5 starts us off. One thing you will notice right off the bat is how beefy Chris has become since the last time we saw him. He's been hitting the gym hard. Must have been injecting himself with strains of that S-virus, if you know what I'm talking about. Chris is fucking jacked in this game. He wears a tight shirt, and all of his muscles are in a constant state of flex. It's ridiculous. In some of the cutscenes, his arms look bigger than his head, which is funny. Yeah, Chris is a beefcake in this RE game. A meat stick, as my late coach Hatter used to say. Joining Chris on his counter-terrorism mission is the badass Sheva Alomar, an agent for the BSAA's West African branch, one of my favorite secondary protagonists in the Resident Evil series. She was partnered with Chris because she is familiar with the area, having grown up there. At the beginning of the game, as well as when you load up each new chapter, assuming you have already beaten the game once, you have the option to play as both Chris and Sheva. Both characters do offer unique gameplay differences, but they aren't that major in the grand scheme of things. Chris is a powerhouse, so he does more damage. Sheva's attacks are more acrobatic, and because she is smaller than Chris, she's able to be thrown up to higher ledges or across large gaps. Both characters have their own inventory space and can carry with them a total of 9 items. Unlike past Resident Evil titles, the size of the item doesn't matter, as each one takes up a single slot. Kind of a disappointment. I enjoy having to organize your inventory in these games, make it the most efficient as possible. That in and of itself is a challenging puzzle, but at the same time, this game does emphasize trading items between each character, keeping track of the types of weapons they are using and the ammo they need, and of course, healing each other using various herb combinations. So it implements inventory management in its own way, so I can give all of that a pass. Throughout the game, you will earn money by picking up gold on the ground, either within breakables or after defeating enemies, or by finding hidden treasures, all of which can be used to buy weapon upgrades, and even specialty weapons for each character you unlock after beating the game, like Chris's Gatling gun or Sheva's longbow, that both have infinite ammo. When I replay this game casually, I never use Chris's weapon because it's too bulky and distracting on screen, but I will give Sheva her longbow. Yeah, it has infinite ammo and is extremely powerful, but its firing speed isn't that fast, and aiming it can be quite difficult, so I feel it's a pretty fair trade-off. Resident Evil 5 would be the first in the series to bring in cooperative multiplayer. The framework had been provided with some of the stuff with Ashley in RE4. That game felt like an awkward poor man's co-op at times. But here, in Resident Evil 5, it has been fully implemented, and honestly, it's the best way to experience it, in my opinion, especially if you are playing it on harder difficulties. It's so much fun blasting the various monsters in this game away, side by side, and strategizing with your resource management, sharing healing items and ammo between players. In a few sequences, you will also be separated and will need to survive on your own, which can make things pretty nerve-wracking. I will admit, having two players does reduce the atmosphere in Resident Evil 5 a bit, though. I don't consider it to be one of the scarier installments, the opposite really. Even when you are separated in those brief sequences, knowing you are still with someone else, sharing the load of everything, does give you a sense of security the other games just don't provide. More confidence facing what might be lurking around every corner. Something else that makes this game less scary than many of the other installments in the RE franchise is the fact that most of it takes place outside, in the sun, during the day. This game is much brighter with its visuals than the other RE games, which certainly affects the overall mood while playing it. There are some annoying aspects to the multiplayer though. There's this part where you are in these dark mining tunnels, and one player has to hold the only light source, a lantern. If that person happens to jump at the sight of something, turning their focus away, or you are both under attack, it can be difficult aiming your weapons at the enemies. Which I mean, that's the whole point of it. It's supposed to make it scary, but you'd think Chris and Sheva would have come prepared and brought some damn flashlights with them or something. Jeez. Also, if you haven't noticed it by now with the footage you have been seeing, the way split-screen co-op is presented in Resident Evil 5 kinda sucks. I hate when developers stagger their player screens like this and have so much wasted black space around them. It's not the most ideal way to play. Even with these drawbacks with the multiplayer though, I still think it's the best way to experience Resident Evil 5. It's how I have the most fun playing it anyways. The story of Resident Evil 5 is not as good as the first three entries in the series, nor do I think it's as good as the first few hours of Resident Evil 4, which are some of the most engaging in any RE game, but I do believe its tone is far more consistent than in RE4, and its ideas stick their landing more effectively by the end too. I actually enjoy Resident Evil 5 more so than I do Resident Evil 4, not only because its gameplay has been refined with a lot of the annoying aspects of it removed, but because its story connects with the events of the original three Resident Evil games a bit more, and ties up a few of their loose ends, mainly surrounding the game's villain, Albert Wesker. As previously mentioned, Wesker, a renowned virologist who had worked for Umbrella and had become the commanding officer of the Alpha team of the Raccoon City Police Department's STARS unit, had survived his apparent death at the end of Resident Evil 1, when he was attacked by the tyrant he had released from its containment unit. He survived thanks to an experimental strain of the T-virus that had been injected into his body, giving him superhuman levels of strength, speed, and durability. In Resident Evil 1, Wesker had stolen research belonging to Umbrella behind the company's back. In Resident Evil 5, he begins working alongside the pharmaceutical division of the multinational conglomerate known as Tricell, one of Umbrella's primary rivals. Together, using a new and enhanced species of the Plaga parasite from Resident Evil 4, they create the Ouroboros virus, derived from the ancient progenitor virus I had brought up a few times in previous videos. In Resident Evil 5, you actually locate a special flower in one of Umbrella's former facilities, now taken over by Tricell, called Stairway of the Sun, native to West Africa. It's the main source of the progenitor virus Umbrella, now Tricell, has been using. It's pretty cool, finally getting to see the physical source behind all of this death and despair. When Chris and Sheva are deployed into Kaijuju, their main goal is to find and capture a man by the name of Ricardo Irving, a bioweapons black market dealer. He had been injecting the locals with test samples of the Ouroboros virus, making them believe it had been a vaccine for a deadly disease plaguing the area. What a scumbag! Chris and Sheva encounter, and are unfortunately forced to kill, many of the civilians infected by Ouroboros, now creatures called Magini. And before I go any further with this story, I should bring up some of the controversy surrounding this game when it first came out. Following a few of the early trailers, the one from E3 2007 being the biggest culprit, a critic and editor for America's Newsweek, Nagai Kroll, I hope I pronounced his name properly, criticized the game for what he believed was racist imagery. Being a man of color, Nagai was offended by the sight of Chris, a white male, shooting and killing black enemies within an African village. And I mean, if you're gonna look at something like this superficially, phrase it in that way, of course it's gonna sound terrible, and it does. While I understand where he may have been coming from with his viewpoint, it also didn't have any context regarding the game's story, and was said long before the game even came out, while it was still in production, so it's completely inconsequential. Resident Evil 5's story just so happens to be set in Africa, and it's just that, a story. Having the game take place in Africa wasn't a decision made out of malice or racism on the part of Capcom's developers, but as a way to switch up the formula, the environment, differentiate the visuals of this game from the visuals in the other games. Simple as that. In past videos, I've mentioned how admirable it is that Capcom is able to make each new entry in the Resident Evil series feel different than the last, even after all these years, and that's gotta be difficult if every step of the way you are met with cynical, unsubstantiated claims like this that throw a wrench into the whole machine. Racism and Resident Evil have never existed in the same sentence with me. The RE games have been pretty inclusive when it comes to its characters and enemies. Resident Evil 5 is no more racist than any of the other games in the series. What am I talking about? They aren't even racist at all. It's a discussion that doesn't even need to happen. In Resident Evil 5, I don't see a story about some muscled-up white guy killing black enemies. I see the BSAA fighting bioterrorism in Africa, and their badass African agent, Sheva, is fighting for her people, protecting her homeland, taking back her country from the clutches of a deadly virus. She's beating the shit out of evil right on her doorstep and sending it packing with its tail between its legs. Now that we have determined that Resident Evil 5 is not racist, not that it needed to be defended anyways, let's move on to the rest of its story. Chris and Sheva would eventually track down Ricardo Irving to his boat on the river, and having no other option for escape, he would willingly inject himself with the same kind of dominant species plaga that had been seen in Resident Evil 4, that had transformed the likes of Osmond Sadler and Ramon Salazar, among others. I like this monster design for Irving here, some sort of aquatic chimera. It's one of the more memorable boss encounters in this game for me, even though you spend most of the time behind a mounted turret. One thing I have always questioned, though, is the logic with these kinds of villains. I get that his back was against the wall, but damn, why is injecting yourself with a transformative serum your next move? Even if Irving succeeded in killing Chris and Sheva in that moment, what kind of an existence would it be to be in that form for the rest of your life? The pain you'd be in, the agony. Job interviews would be impossible. Getting laid is certainly out of the question. Unless, of course, someone out there is into it. Giant evil sea monsters. You never know. There's a kink for everything nowadays. Anywho, let's get back to Albert Wesker. His plan is to release the Ouroboros virus into the Earth's atmosphere in order to infect all of humanity. Ouroboros, which by the way gets its name from the snake-like creature Ouroboros from Greek mythology that ate itself, is an incredibly powerful virus that does one of two things to its host. It either causes an uncontrollable mutation that tears their body apart, killing them, or it successfully integrates with the host and gives them superhuman abilities. In order for the host to survive the transformation process, they need to have a rare genetic trait within their DNA. Only a small percentage of humanity possess this trait, which is why the vast majority would be wiped out if they became infected with the Ouroboros parasite. But this is not a concern of Wesker's, as his ultimate goal is to act as a god and rule over the surviving superpowered beings on Earth. Chris and Sheva would make their way through the West African marshlands, battling Ouroboros-infected members of the Nidapaya tribe, as well as large crocodiles, which are freaky as shit. I hate running past those things. They eventually find themselves in an ancient underground city, solve a few puzzles, and finally reach Wesker, who is joined by a mysterious, masked figure that looks sort of like a plague doctor. This individual had been seen multiple times throughout the game, interfering with your mission, and earlier had helped Irving escape the heroes using a smoke bomb. The mysterious figure is revealed to be Chris's former partner, Jill Valentine, brainwashed by Wesker using a special device attached to her chest. Chris and Sheva would be forced to fight her as she does all these crazy backflips and hurricanranas, wearing a costume that resembles Zero Suit Samus. After dealing enough damage to Jill, but not too much that you kill her, Chris is able to remove the device and free her from her brainwashing. From Jill, you learn that Wesker is able to maintain his superhuman abilities by injecting himself with very precise and time-sensitive doses. Altering the size of these doses could prove fatal to him, or at the very least would weaken his powers. Chris and Sheva are able to track down syringes of Wesker's serum, with the intention of using them on him in their next encounter. You fight Wesker at an airfield, where he's prepping his bomber aircraft for takeoff. He's wearing sunglasses with a long overcoat, and dodges gunfire like he's Agent Smith from The Matrix. It's insane. Distracting him with RPGs, Chris and Sheva manage to weaken Wesker with several injections of his serum. But sadly, it's not enough to take him down, and their battle would continue within the interior of the bomber aircraft that takes off into the sky. During the scuffle, the bomber is disabled, and its cargo bay opened, causing it to crash into a nearby volcano. The endgame boss in Resident Evil 5 is epic, one of my favorites in the franchise. Against an Ouroboros-empowered Wesker, it's awesome, but man is it fucking absurd at the same time, and very difficult to take seriously. For starters, being this close to this much lava without any sort of protective suit would be fatal after a short while. And then of course there's that infamous sequence when the Resident Evil series jumped the shark, even more so than what was depicted in Resident Evil 4, with Chris having to save Sheva by pushing and even punching a large boulder. It doesn't feel real when you first see it, and what's even wilder to me is the fact that he can move such a big rock with his bare hands, but is incapable of opening a door or lifting a gate without Sheva's help. Explain that to me. Once Wesker is defeated, the heroes aim dual rocket launchers at him from a helicopter, which go right through his head and blow him into itty-bitty pieces. The reign of Albert Wesker's terror is finally over. Resident Evil 5 might have a lot of ridiculous moments in it, feeling like a cheesy action movie at times, and it's probably why a lot of RE fans may have mixed feelings towards it, especially in more recent years. but like I had mentioned earlier in the video, I enjoy it more than its predecessor, Resident Evil 4. I think its gameplay is slightly more polished, its implementation of cooperative multiplayer is a lot of fun, and its story, while over the top and exaggerated in areas, is pretty damn engaging and ties up a few loose ends introduced in those earlier games. Resident Evil 5 is one of my personal favorite entries in the series, and was the very first game in the franchise I ever played, so I have a bit of a bias towards it. Yeah, I kinda lied to all of you in the earlier videos of this retrospective series. It wasn't the remake of Resident Evil 2 from 2019 that was my first Resident Evil game. No, my cherry was popped with Resident Evil 5. I had played it with my partner shortly after we started dating, back in the early 2010s, and while I was a bit lost with some of the story elements, not having any of the context of the previous games, I did find the gameplay itself to be really fun and addictive. Even to this day, when we play Resident Evil 5, we can still make each other laugh by spamming the circle button while waiting for your teammate to open doors.
Hurry! Shove
Roger.
Come on! Come on!
Roger.
Shove
Roger.
Come on!
Okay.
Come on!
Come on.
Hurry!
Come on.
Come on!
Okay.
Hurry!
Roger.
I want to thank each and every one of you for watching my review of Resident Evil 5. Let me know what you think of the game down in the comments section below. If you'd like to support the channel, ensure its future, and help me produce more content like this, you can do so by subscribing, hitting that bell icon for updates and notifications, and by becoming a producer over on patreon.com/channelNerdGasm if you can. I will see you all in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and always stay nerdy.